airlines. Without further ado, gentlemen, let's get started.
Perfect. Thank you, Julie. So as mentioned, Ed and I are going to talk to you about some cyber attacks specific to the flight and airline industry. I will say that a lot of the things we're going to talk about have commonality around different industries as well. So, even if you're not directly associated with airlines and flights, I think the content is going to be relevant to everybody. So we'll quickly do some introductions, then we'll talk about why we're focused on the airline specifically, dig into some areas that we see as emerging trends within that industry. Then we'll start to talk about what to really anticipate in the coming months. So what does the future look like ahead from a threat point of view? And then finally, we'll just give you some remediations and some recommendations on how to prepare for some of those things that we think are going to change and influence the threats within the airline industry moving forward. So Ed, if you just want to quickly do an introduction.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. I'm Ed Williams. I'm the VP of EMEA. I've been around for quite a long time, over 15 years. I've worked on large multinational organizations, governments, and SMEs. And the thing I like to tell everybody is I've worked from everything from submarines to rockets, including airplanes and surrounding infrastructure. Some areas of expertise, it's broader than that, but pen testing is what I've done mainly. Lots of red teaming. Big fan of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, something I've contributed to personally, and the team has as well. So we use that whenever we can. And then obviously vulnerability assessments.
Perfect. Thanks, Ed. And my name's Damian Archer. Been in the industry for almost 20 years now, having delivered engagements on both sides of the Atlantic for some of the biggest organizations in the world. Much like Ed, focused on the offensive security side of things, product security, AppSec, threat modeling, a lot of DevSecOps areas that we're starting to see become more prevalent. And yeah, real advocate for the industry. I think the work that we do is vitally important, and I love being a practitioner within the security industry. So now we'll just move into the current state. So this is really ultimately what we're seeing and why we're talking about this. There is certainly an increase in threats across the airline industry. We're starting to see some of that in the news. We're starting to see some of those threats become realistic. And that's largely due to the kind of hybrid technology environment that exists within the airline industry. There's a big focus on improvements because of the increased and emerging threats that we're starting to see. There are a lot of organizations within the aviation industry that are starting to develop frameworks to address those attacks, starting to create regulations and governance that mean that airlines and aviation organizations have to adhere to certain regulations. And those challenges still remain, right? The interconnected nature of airlines means that it's very difficult to eliminate vulnerabilities completely. And I think the airline industry straddles significantly across lots of different verticals. So things like supply chain obviously pose a risk, but there's also aspects of manufacturing from an OT point of view, and just kind of monitoring of delicate systems within airline infrastructure. We'll move on to the next slide. Why are we talking about it? The attack surface has increased, as I mentioned. The sector is really looking at maturity and growth across the board. We're in a post-COVID world now where people want to get on airlines, people want to fly, people want to go places. And that means that the systems have to expand at the same rate as that usage. So as that growth continues, sometimes it's very, very difficult to remain at the same pace from a security point of view in patching vulnerabilities, increasing security programs and postures, just in alignment with that growth that we're seeing. Airlines have very, very complex supply chains, and that could be from a software point of view, that could be from a hardware point of view. It's very difficult to make sure that any supply chains are following the right security framework. So in the airline industry, where it is a mix of software and hardware from a supply chain point of view, we're starting to see more and more threats kind of bleed into the airline industry. And the data is high value, right? Whether it's IP, whether it's personal information of passengers, whether it's personal information of VIPs, all of that information is very, very high value data that is extremely attractive to to bad guys across the board. And then finally, last two things: sector consolidation. It's a highly regulated industry. There's lots of M&A consolidation around different airline companies and equipment as well within that. And then lastly, technical debt. This is something we see across the board. And technical debt is really just talking about the fact that, we do have to accelerate the way that we do utilize and use technology. And in doing that, we sometimes introduce new technologies before the security is well understood. So that technical debt from a security point of view, as new technologies are implemented in the airline sector, is something that we're seeing prevalent, not just in the airline sector, but across the board from a security posture point of view. I'll hand over to Ed to talk about some of the emerging and prominent threats that we see in that sector.
Thank you. Thanks, Damian. Excellent stuff. So what we see in third-party supply risks, as Damian mentioned, it's a asset-heavy, lots of technical debt around. So that poses significant issues, threats, and risks to the airline industry. I think we can all remember the MoveIt hack, many 600 breaches with many top airlines unfortunately involved. So there's a real focus from the attackers moving down the supply chain, where it's a little bit easier, where they can plant some sort of malicious code and then leave that filter through the system and work up. Similarly then with open source software, again, with such a large threat actors looking to get into organizations, specifically in the airline industry, they can pick and choose where they attack. Open source is a really good one to go for because of the large footprint that airlines have. There's lots of different moving parts, so it's a big juicy target for them. I'll run through some of the mitigations because I think that's important. It's really important to conduct security assessments across the supply chain. Difficult to do in large complex environments, worth doing and worth putting the effort into it, and that can filter down then through further down the supply chain. Make sure that there's security clauses in contracts. Again, sounds straightforward, but as you're moving up into more highly regulated industries, it's really important to do that. Making sure that you're auditing vendors in terms of good practices. We talk about patching, passwords, policies, all the good things that we talk about all the time. Sound really easy, but as things get more complicated, they become more and more difficult across these large enterprises. We spoke about technical debt. That is still a big one that we're seeing for many of our clients. I don't want to use the words Windows NT, but that is a factor of things that we're seeing. Making sure that you've got access controls, change controls, all the things that we talk about and that we know that are important, but putting them into an enterprise environment is very difficult and needs constant attention. There's, I've said this many times, but there's no one point where you become secure and everybody goes home for tea and medals. You've got to keep moving forward with your security and your security posture and just making it a really difficult nut to crack. And then making sure then you're doing things like encrypting sensitive data, implementing least privilege access controls, and then logs, making sure your logs. One thing we do see across not just the airline industry, but across all our verticals is either excessive logging or not enough logging, and both of those are just as bad. So it's really important that you've got that blend right as you're moving through that supply chain. Very difficult. Okay, so speed versus security, again, those two things don't really go too well together. The quicker organizations move, the more and or less secure they tend to be. We've seen things like Citrix software being vulnerable, AI chatbots, which we'll talk about later, being vulnerable and not as secure as they should be. And of course, then Microsoft and all the large providers of cloud infrastructure, they've got a big part to play in all of this. And as the cloud has grown, so has the footprint for every organization. So again, some quick mitigations. Secure development lifecycle, really important for organizations. Making sure that they embed that security right from the beginning. All too often we see security as an afterthought, as we've done this, how do we now secure it? It needs to be really embedded right from the beginning. Making sure you know where your assets are. The hardest thing to do is to secure an asset you don't know where it is. Make sure you get that done. Lots of optimization of tools. There is no one tool that will fix all your problems, but embedding good usage of tools with people and process and technology is certainly going to help. And then, my favorite, regular pen tests is going to make sure that you're getting ahead of any potential issues from an offensive perspective. So again, really important. Okay, ransomware, everybody's favorite. So we know that ransomware has a crippling impact on all sectors, including the airline industry. Disruptions to passengers, finances, and even reputation, which I think is probably in the airline sector, really, really important. We see a large carrier at the moment struggling with their reputation in terms of security and safety, and these things are really important. When we dig into it a little bit, some sort of operational disruptions, so flights delays. I'm sure we've all flown and there's been that 4-hour delay, and everybody's has to sigh a deep breath and just sort of get on with it. Ground control issues. If any ransomware can get in, they're going to look to disrupt ground control, because that's a nice way to make things really complicated for a large number of people. Financial losses, so ransomware payments, whether it's crypto, Bitcoin, whatever that might be, then the recovery costs associated with that then can be massive when you're talking about really complex environments. So it's really important that you try and reduce the risk of ransomware and make sure your recovery costs are as small and as contained can be. And then obviously then the loss of revenue, which is really important for what is a really asset-heavy industry. Reputational damage, again, we already spoke about passenger trust. I know I fly with certain airlines because I know they're safe, and they put their passengers' safety in front of everybody, in front of everything else, and that's really important. Similarly with security and banks and things of that nature. And then, of course, the negative, there'll be negative publicity. Making sure that airlines are on the front foot and putting passenger safety, their data, their IP on the front foot. Some things like that are really important. And of course, then the cascading effects, the supply chain vulnerabilities that we've already spoken about. It's one thing to secure the airline, but of course, all those moving parts underneath it, super important to get ahead of it with good pen testing and good governance around all of those things. We spoke about ransomware. It's on the rise. It can be really crippling. There's a few mitigations that I would always recommend. Post-based anti-malware on assets, making sure you've got strong email security. Really, really important that you're, as a business, monitoring emails and you're not getting somebody in HR clicking on that CV that is not good. IR, incident response, again, really important. Not so much offensive, but more defensive. If something happens, and of course, it's not a question of if, but when, that you've got the playbooks ready to go. You know what you need to do. You know who you need to speak to make sure that if ransomware does get in, it can be quickly contained and then you can move forward with your business. We spoke about monitoring of logs for critical systems. What I find works really well is when we're doing red and purple team engagements, is actively working with certain types of scenarios. Like my favorite is getting credentials or credential gains. If you can monitor that and tick off certain events, then you can move quickly on that to make sure you isolate a host and stop those credentials being spread. And then there's threat intel type issues. Again, we see a lot of this in the industry. Trying to get 1 foot ahead or one pace ahead of where the bad guys are coming. I'll be honest, for airlines, they're coming all the time. So you just need to really stay one step ahead of that. And then things like user access. If somebody doesn't need access to certain things, don't give them access. But we see traditionally when we're pen testing and doing offensive work for organizations, too many people have got too much access and it's not revoked correctly and managed properly. Difficult things to do, but with good controls can be done and managed. Okay, I'll hand back to Damian.
No guesses for what's coming next around what to anticipate in the industry. I think it would be the same for every single industry out there, and we're going to continue seeing this for the next 12 months as we have for the last 12 months. So everybody's favorite, artificial intelligence. AI ML has now been around for what I say been around since ChatGPT really broke the mold and started the hype train that is AI back in November 2022. We've seen constant use cases, constant media coverage of AI, how it's going to change everything, how we're moving into a Skynet world. And we're going to talk about that from a threat point of view. So yeah, absolutely, artificial intelligence is great, and we'll talk about some of the good things that it's doing across the board from a security point of view and within different industries. But it's not all good. There are definitely data privacy concerns that we're starting to see organizations become more and more in tune with. People querying ChatGPT or other AI chatbots can lead to a misuse of the data that's actually entered. So once you've searched for something, that then falls outside of your remit. Utilizing those things to query information about different passengers, data collection off outside of your own ecosystem and using those artificial intelligence, all of those things are really, really significant concerns, as they always have been when we share data outside of our own ecosystem. Algorithmic bias. So we don't know, or as a consumer of things like ChatGPT and Copilot, you don't know what that data is trained on. Many organizations are talking about creating their own models, but I still think we're a ways off that. So as and when you utilize external AI within the operations of an organization, you can create situations where profiling of passengers is done unfairly because of the model and the data that's being trained. And then there's also the significance of actually poisoning that model to make decisions that shouldn't be made. System dependence, so over-reliance on AI can ultimately lead to vulnerabilities. As and when you're starting to use AI, and we've seen this in other industries recently, where people have used and implemented AI chatbots without the right level of security controls. So bad guys see that, they use that to try and circumvent controls around contracting, pricing in online chatbots. So relying on those things that you don't have the right level of control over can lead to pretty significant reputational damage. And then finally, explainability. Yeah, if you're using a commercial AI model that you don't necessarily understand how it's been trained, it's very difficult to understand the accuracy of the results that are being given and provided by that model. And that, from a passenger point of view, that also means fairness, right? And how people are being treated. And it could be that you're utilizing AI to speed up the effectiveness of a call center based upon the cues from the person calling in with that call center. It's difficult to know how that person is going to be treated if you're using a commercial off-the-shelf AI model. But of course, it's not all bad. There's some cool things going on with AI at the moment. So threat detection. There's two trains of thought, I think, around threat detection. Do we increase the number of hay when we're looking for the needles, or do we reduce the number of hay when utilizing AI? And what's the best methodology? I think some of these things continue to be discussed, and I don't think we have a great answer for that in the security industry as to what is the best way to utilize AI in order to complement what we're doing from a human point of view. Efficiency. Obviously, AI is going to have huge impacts from an efficiency point of view, both in the security industry and across the board. So automating checks, automating different controls, all of those things are kind of narrow AI focused, but they can have a massive impact on the efficiency from a security point of view and also from a resilience point of view. Real-time analysis. So, having a system where CCTV is fed into a room with humans analyzing that is very, very different from having an AI analyze that footage. But again, that goes back to the previous point around explainability and bias. That AI is going to develop biases based upon how it's been programmed and how it's been trained. So that real-time threat analysis, although it can be deemed as a strength, it also should be used with that human influence or that human oversight and governance around it as well. And then facial recognition, again, same points apply, right? AI can have that bias, but it can speed things up. So using AI in the right way with the right frameworks and the right governance around it is really how we're going to see that success. But it's here to stay. It's going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to be prevalent in the technology world. Any organization that is utilizing technology is going to be forced along into this post-AI world that we're moving towards. But it's not ready just yet. Ed ran a couple of AI queries for some pictures. This is AI now. This is where we are. And while these are kind of comedic pictures, just to kind of show how far AI has to go, this is what we're working with, right? These are the kind of things that there is some development that needs to be done around that. Although I will say that I think if Tom Cruise did play Spider-Man, it'd probably be contracted that he didn't have to wear a mask, just so his likeness was more closely associated. All right, Ed, I'll pass on to you to talk about how to prepare for the year ahead.
Thank you. I think those pictures as well speak a little bit more about me than they probably should. Okay, how do we prepare for the upcoming year? So things are moving really fast. So there's such a lot happening. There's so many areas to cover: supply chain, ransomware, all of the things, patching, all of that stuff. So where do we start? So I would always start with people and awareness. the culture of an organization, the security culture of that organization is what is going to help you. That's what's going to make you secure or not secure. It's the dev who's putting in a really secure password right at the beginning of a process, as opposed to password 01. It's the basics that kill people. So making sure that you really, really got that security culture built in. And that can be done through training, shadowing, people working together, but with a real strong foundation of security. As I said, making sure that you're patching boxes straight away, not waiting 24 days or whatever it might be. That culture is really, really important. We talk about good password hygiene as well with people in awareness. Having that good training, that good cultural awareness makes people aware that security is not just the security team that are looking after it, it's everybody. Every single individual needs to be aware and be accountable for their own security, and then that of the business. Making sure that people only have the privileges that they need. So again, it sounds really basic, but when we're performing pen tests, it's amazing how often when we hop onto a box, we're able to get some sort of access. That individual has got way too much permission than he or she probably needs. And that might be something that's happened over time as privileges have crept in and not been revoked. So making sure that you're always on top of who has what, do they need that access, what access control do they need, and how does that work? What also works really well is understanding how data flows through a business, how people interact with that data within a business. And that's a really difficult challenge. But once you get on top of that, then you know then who can have access to what and who needs what. Like I'll give an example, just thinking about it. When we finance systems always have too much access. Individuals in finance tend to have significant access, and they're a nice juicy target for malicious threat actors. So I'd really concentrate on HR, finance, those types of individuals, because they do need access, but not as much as they probably get. Okay, technology and process, this is quite a big one. I'll start sort of at the left of the maturity diagram as I think about it. Vulnerability management is really, really important. Sounds really basic and is done by a lot of organizations, but it's not done particularly well. Like when we're brought in to do threat and vulnerability management work, it's normally somebody who's tried and started it, has some sort of handle on what's going on, but it just swamped with the sheer volume of issues. I call it spreadsheet hell, where they're moving spreadsheets around and the numbers at the bottom just gets bigger and bigger. So it's really important that you're regularly assessing your infrastructure for vulnerabilities, but you're also fixing the really important ones, and that's where your vendor can come in and help. They can really assess, are these important risks? Is that Windows NT box sitting in the corner, has that got real issues? And is it a problem if it does get compromised? Probably yes, but we don't know. Making sure that your data is secure. Again, it sounds really straightforward, but making sure that it's encrypted at rest, encrypted in transit, makes it really hard for an attacker to grab things and do things that they shouldn't be able to do. And the key thing about this, specifically for the airline industry, is all that technical debt, all of that complex supply chain is really difficult to get your arms around. So you really need to make sure that you're covering every base, not just the shiny new Windows boxes, but all the old kit as well needs to be brought into that security program and not just sort of left as if it's too hard a problem. Because an attacker they will use the least difficult route to get into an environment. So we talk about network segmentation next. Segregation segmentation, again, very difficult to do in reality and in practical terms. But as I mentioned earlier, if you can understand how your data flows through your organization, you'll be in a really good place to be able to segregate and isolate certain environments, particularly critical systems. I've seen it done really well, and I've also seen it done really poorly, where it doesn't actually work, and in the end, you end up just opening everything so everybody can speak, an all type of environment, which is what I wouldn't recommend. So what you need to do, as I mentioned, understand those data flows, and then work around that then in terms of access controls and segmentation through appropriate controls. MFA, so I'm a big advocate of MFA for every account. It's not practical for particularly massive organizations, but certainly for administrators and areas of importance, for HR and finance, making sure they've got multi-factor authentication. It does add an extra layer. It isn't the be-all and end-all, and they can be vulnerable, and there are things that need to be done also. But putting in MFA is certainly going to raise the bar, particularly pretty quick, I would say. Making sure you've got good detection and response. Again, I mentioned earlier, it's not a case of if, but when. We know something is going to happen. What that incident looks like, I don't know. It's really important that we're investing in robust security monitoring tools. Again, I mentioned logging too much and logging too little are both as bad as each other. So really understanding what you've got and how you're going to log it and monitor it. And that's where you bring in the experts with their purple and red teaming expertise. You can focus on specific areas and areas that are really important. I mentioned credential dumping, my favorite, making sure that you know what events you're looking for, and then you can ping off that then and work, make sure you're responding, you're detecting and responding on the right things. There's some really good frameworks around, NIST, ISO 27001. They're not going to make you secure just by adopting them. They're certainly going to get you down that track, which is really important. So I would strongly recommend aligning yourselves with a framework. And a good framework then will bring in all these other technical mitigations, which is really important. Okay, so threat intel, collaboration, threat intel. We spoke about threat intel earlier. There's a consolidation within the airline industry. I would strongly suggest that they begin to share information at a sort of event type level. I think that'd be really useful. Don't see as much of it now as we probably should. And something we'll be pushing for with our clients. The more actionable threat intel an organization has, the more they can get one step ahead and then making sure their defenses are aligned appropriately. Again, we spoke about supply chain and how important it is. Really understanding what your supply chain is, what it looks like, and then adopting security and making sure that they're doing all the good things that they should be doing, SDLC, patching passwords, and all of that can be audited appropriately. And probably one of the most important things is the continuous improvement. We know if you're not moving forward in this industry, you're standing still, and that is not a good place to be because you're going to get picked off. So making sure you're doing regular security assessments, those can be technical and process oriented. I would suggest to pair of them together. Regular pen testing, my favorite, security assessments, and then actually fixing issues. There's nothing more frustrating as a practitioner when you spent hours and hours creating a really good report. There's hundreds of issues in it, it's a really good job. Give it to the client, you do the debrief and all that stuff, and they get it, they understand the risks. You go back 12 months later and it's exactly the same, nothing has changed. So making sure you're actually fixing the issues. And what I would say from that is actually speak to us. If we're giving you a report and the fix doesn't quite work or doesn't quite work in that context, let us know and we can give another fix so we can add some additional context. That'll help in making sure that things do get fixed appropriately, because it's really important that that happens. And one thing I'd also suggest as well, when you are fixing, get a retest. Again, sometimes, and we've seen it all too often, retests, while they might fix one specific issue, can cause other issues, and that is something that we do see quite often. Making sure that there's training for people, ongoing training, make sure that everybody's up to date with latest threats and trends. We know passwords are really important, but MFA, does everybody know that that needs to be securely integrated into an environment? So things like that are really important. And where we see organizations that are really mature, their cybersecurity training is always on point. Constant, it's not an overhead or too much work, it's appropriate to that individual at that time. So things like that are really important. Okay, that's the end of that. Any questions?
All right, thank you guys. So at this point, a number of questions have come in, but please continue submitting your questions and we will get to as many as we can before the end of the hour. All right, guys, the first question is, how transferable are airline-related issues to other industries?
Jumping on that one, I think they're very, very transferable. I think when we talk about threats across different industry sectors, something that we do at Trustwave is put out a monthly threat briefing that is tailored to specific industry verticals. And as we continue to do that and have done for, I think, the last 12 months now, we do start to see lots of commonality. Things like ransomware come up time after time. And then some of those recommendations that Ed has gone through, those are, fairly generic and broad in the recommendation, so that they do address a lot of the threats that are, more low-hanging fruit, entry-level threats. Like I say, things like ransomware, propagation of ransomware, credential stuffing, those types of things. So absolutely, they are the threats that we see specific to airline. I think the exploitation methods and the ways in which bad guys are going after airlines are very similar to other sectors. I think the difference is that the gold at the end of the rainbow for those attackers is slightly different from what it might be in other organizations. So yeah, to concisely answer the question, Julie, I think, yeah, these threats are applicable across different industries, whether it's airline, transport, hospitality, industrial, whatever it might be, there is definite commonality there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add to that as well. We see that in our pen testing as well. You know, if we're getting into an environment, there's normally a few mechanisms that always tend to work, and it's almost industry agnostic. As Damian mentioned, what's at the end of it, that sort of what the bad guys are looking for is different between industries. So making sure you've got the basics done is 80% of the work, but it's a hard 80%.
Okay. This next question came in, Ed, when you were on the ransomware slide. How are we starting to resolve this issue of ransomware?
Oh, ransomware, everybody's favorite. So to really understand ransomware, it's really important to understand how it works. So there's a way that ransomware gets in, normally via phishing or some sort of vulnerability in the external facing infrastructure. So if you can stop that, that's a really good start. So you know, I mentioned some phishing mitigations, training. We've got a product that does a really good job at finding and isolating pernicious and malicious emails. That's really good. Doing some external vulnerability scanning, that's going to get rid of a lot of that stuff. What then becomes really hard is when the ransomware gets into an environment. Normally it's a Windows environment. Once it's in that Windows environment, there's a number of different ways that it moves around. So I mentioned credential dumping. Most ransomware does that. It grabs some sort of admin password or credential if it can, and then it'll use a pass the hash technique or something to move laterally. So we spoke about segregation, segmentation, making sure that that happens. So if ransomware does get in, the impact is actually really small. Again, difficult to do in environments. One thing I would suggest, and I didn't mention directly, is making sure that you've got hardened devices, that every device is really hard. So your desktop is hard. There's nothing more frustrating, actually, when you're doing a red team or something and you land on a desktop, you can't actually move laterally, sort of stuck in that little environment. You can't escalate privileges. You can't go from one box to another. So making sure there's defense in depth all across the environment is going to make ransomware harder. Not impossible, but harder. Then I'd move along then. The next part, I'll be quick, I promise. Making sure that if there is ransomware, you're seeing it quickly. So we spoke about detection and response. You know, again, it's not if, but when. So if it is happening, you can see it. You can isolate those hosts really quickly and then get your environment back up and running. So there's a number of, there's a chain, and there's a number of elements you need to break to make sure that you're secure in that environment. But it is difficult.
And just to kind of add and build on what Ed has said, I think though everything we know about ransomware points to the fact that there are very, very few techniques that are actually used by ransomware. There's been a lot of research done recently, both by Trustwave and other organizations, that map commonalities between different ransomware families. When you start to look at those commonalities, you can actually remediate for a very small set of techniques in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and that will block a lot of different ransomware families just through, less of a remediation effort. And then the other thing I would add is sort of early warning signs that you might be under attack. Canary tokens are a really, really good way to do that. You can install canary tokens, whether it's in your Active Directory from a user point of view, whether it's in some of the modern containerization environments that you might have, or even externally on your external facing perimeter through the use of honeypots plus canary tokens. Those are really, really good early warning signs that if something triggers, you know that there could be an attack imminent or currently underway within the environment. So, there's defensive measures that Ed talked about, having a robust offensive security program, but then also utilizing some early warning indicators around canary tokens and honeypots, I think is a good third recommendation to really fill out a robust security program against ransomware specifically.
Yeah, just to add on to what you've added on, those are really important. One thing I would say is don't rely on one of them, have all of them together, because when we do see organizations that are compromised, they tend to rely too heavily on one aspect of that. Having a broad security strategy is what's going to help you over the long term.
Okay, let's see. We got think 3 more. So keep sending in your questions and we'll get to as many as we can. All right, the next one is, what are the most critical systems airlines need to protect from cyber attacks? Example, the reservation system, in-flight entertainment systems, etc.
Yeah, shall I go first? I'll go on this one. So, Julie, I think you mentioned a lot of them. Obviously, the security on a plane is paramount. We know that industry does a lot of work on that, and they're pretty robust. But they're always looking to make sure that they are further secure. What I would focus on is the data. People's data is really important to them. It's really important to the airline industry. So making sure that data is secure within an organization and within the airline industry. What is hard to do is, we spoke about technical debt, and we've seen this firsthand, a lot of organizations have disparate data, so there's data all over the place. They don't actually know where that one source is. So trying to get your arms around that in terms of a good security posture is really important. And once you understand where that data is, then you can put something around it. Now, I've spoken a lot about data flows, and that's really important. Once you understand how that data flows through an organization, or once you're on the plane or anything like that, then you can put security around it. But if you don't understand it, and as you're building on top of tech stacks, it gets harder and harder. So making sure you understand where your security is and the data that resides is really, really important.
And I to circle back to the first question we got asked, that exercise around data flow, understanding how what the roots of normal access to that sensitive data is applicable across different industries. And I think it's something that's often neglected. People just make the assumption that, hey, this is secure. But in all organizations, the most sensitive data has to be accessed at some point by some system. Understanding what the use cases for access of that sensitive data are, and then mapping those back to abuse cases, and to use some kind of SDLC terminology, is a really, really good way to identify what an attack chain might look like within your organization, because that's ultimately where the bad guys are going to go for the high value data. So understanding what the use cases of access for that high value data are can lead to very good abuse case analysis from an attack point of view as well.
And just again, to add on to what you've already added on, where we see clients gain maturity quickly is when they're working with us around specific scenarios. Like, we would expect vulnerability scanning, asset management, pen testing, all of that stuff to happen. But then on top of that, then, red teams, purple teams, scenario offensive type testing. Clients get huge benefit from those because they're very, very targeted and very, very specific. We do them for the airline industry around user data, because that is really important, and how they can best map that data. So those things are all really important.
Okay, and here's another very important question.
Yeah,
how vulnerable are airline loyalty
everything's
points?
important. Nothing's important.
How vulnerable are airline loyalty programs to data breaches and identity theft?
So I'll jump in first. I think loyalty programs are often targeted, not necessarily from a data breach point of view and identity theft point of view, but often for kind of gamification of the point systems. So people trying to give themselves additional points, people trying to buy reward flights and other things using the loyalty programs. I think those are often the things we see across the board for loyalty programs, whether it's at the gas pump or whether it's part of a mileage program for an airline. People trying to exploit and gain additional points, additional services, upgrades, and things like that through the loyalty program. I would say that tends to, at least in my experience, that tends to be a more prevalent attack vector around the points. But Ed, I'd definitely be interested in your view as to whether you see those as a kind of data breach and identity theft area as well.
Yeah, I do. What we have seen as well is hackers using that system to gain further access into an environment. Once you get a foothold into the environment, if you're particularly nefarious, you're going to use any way you can to get a foothold, and then use that then as your launching pad. So in limited scenarios, we have seen cases where an easy way into an organization is via something like that, because it's more internet facing and public facing. And if they can get a foothold onto an operating system, something, then if there is an appropriate segmentation segregation, and they use that then to gain further access into an environment. So again, I'm going to use the word very important because everything's very important, making sure that your external facing infrastructure and the web applications that sit on top of it are routinely assessed and as secure as they can be. We know that everything can't be 100% secure. As Damian mentioned, sensitive data needs to be accessed. So by its very nature, it's insecure or available. Perhaps insecure is not the right word, but certainly available. So making sure that you have appropriate controls around that thing. And then if something is compromised, how do you find it, isolate it, and remove it?
Okay. Looks like this is the last question. With the increasing use of Internet of Things in aircraft, how are airlines securing these interconnected devices from cyber threats?
I think IoT and OT are just becoming more and more prevalent across the board. Ed mentioned utilizing reward program servers and infrastructure to gain further access, but I think a lot of what we see as well includes IoT. They're often the weakest point on a network. One of the things I would add is that airlines tend to have in some cases, a more modern environment and probably are more have more investment to making securing of those IoT and OT devices. So, but yeah, I mean, we see this a lot across, whether it's airlines or whether it's other industries, the implementation and integration of IoT and that convergence point of OT versus IT becoming a really, really common attack vector to hop into different areas. So exploitation of an IoT device tends to be far easier and more trivial than exploitation of a complex server, just because there is a significant lack of patches and updates onto those IoT devices because of the simplicity of them. If you can get access to that IoT environment, then trying to compromise the convergence point and pivot into the IT environment is becoming more and more common. And in the interconnected world that is the aviation industry, specifically in flight and areas like that, that's becoming a really, really common attack vector. And it's not necessarily an attack vector that's leading to mass data breaches, but it's an attack vector that certainly has a huge impact on reputation from an airline security point of view. But Ed, I'll let you add on to that. It's a huge growth area across the industry.
Yeah, it's massive. So I can give some examples that we've used fairly recently. So IoT devices normally have an IPv4 stack, an IPv6 stack. The IPv4 stack was secure, really good. And then we just started scanning IPv6 and there was issues and vulnerabilities, and we got onto a device and then used that then to get further into the environment. So exactly as Amy mentioned, it's a real nice attack vector at the moment. I don't think organizations understand IoT as well as they probably should. They understand some of it, but there's certainly parts of weakness, and it all fits into the supply chain management. Do you trust something that you're just going to drop into your environment? So you need to put that rigor around OT IoT devices to make sure that they are secure, and then get a trusted third party in to make sure that what they say they're doing, they are doing, and if they aren't, then you can hold their feet to the flames.
All right. Thanks, guys. That's it for questions. If you guys have any additional questions that come in mind before I close out, feel free to submit them, and we'll be sure to have one of our experts follow up with you. As a reminder, you will be receiving a copy of the webinar recording via email by the end of the week. And if you're interested in learning more about today's topic, you can submit a request by clicking on the mail icon at the bottom of your screen. Before you leave, we would greatly appreciate it if you could take a moment to fill out our post-show survey to rate this session. You can view that below. You will also be prompted to take the survey at the conclusion of the webinar. All right, that's it. Do you guys have anything else to add?
Nothing, just thanks for hosting, Julie. Always enjoy discussing these things. So, and thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, stay safe out there. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the webinar and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.